In the spring of 1942, Winston Churchill stood before a map of the world in the cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall. His eyes blazed with characteristic fire as he outlined his latest strategic vision. Norway. The British would strike north, reclaim the fjords, roll up Hitler's northern flank. It would be brilliant, audacious, the kind of blow that would turn the tide of the war. Across the table sat a man with horn-rimmed spectacles and an expression of barely controlled fury. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, had heard enough. He snapped the pencil in his hand, leaned forward, and delivered two words that would echo through the corridors of power. "I flatly disagree." What happened in that room over the next 7 hours would determine whether Britain survived the war or squandered what little military strength it had left on a strategic fantasy. And this wasn't the first time, or the last. For nearly 4 years, one man stood between Churchill's genius and Britain's destruction. His name was Alan Brooke, and he saved the Allied cause by doing something no one else dared. He said no to Winston Churchill. May 1940. The beaches of Dunkirk stretched before Lieutenant General Alan Brooke like a vision of apocalypse. German panzers had shattered the French army. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped against the sea, and Brooke, commanding 2 corps, had been given an impossible task: hold the line while 300,000 men evacuated. The Germans came at Wichita on May 26th with everything they had. Brooke's divisions fought them to a standstill along the Ypres-Came Canal. For 3 days, his troops absorbed attack after attack, while behind them, the greatest evacuation in military history unfolded. German reconnaissance forces probed for weaknesses. Brooke plugged every gap. When the Belgians surrendered on May 28, leaving a 26-kilometer hole in the defensive line, Brooke rushed 4 divisions forward before the Germans could exploit it. He understood, something most British commanders didn't. This wasn't a battle to be won. It was a catastrophe to be managed. Every hour his men held meant thousands more soldiers reaching England. Every position defended was another battalion saved to fight another day. On May 31st, Brooke himself was evacuated. The operation continued another 4 days. More than 338,000 Allied soldiers reached England. Churchill called it a miracle. Brooke called it military competence under impossible conditions. But the nightmare wasn't over. On June 2nd, just days after returning to England, Brooke received orders that made his blood run cold. Return to France, form a second British Expeditionary Force, resume the fight. Brooke knew what every professional soldier knew. France was finished. The French army was collapsing. German panzers were racing toward Paris. Sending British troops back wasn't strategy. It was suicide dressed up as political solidarity. He picked up the phone and called London. Field Marshal John Dill, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, was on the line behind him. Brooke could hear Churchill's voice. The Prime Minister wanted British forces to stay and fight, to show the French that Britain wouldn't abandon them. Brooke's response was ice-cold and utterly devastating. It is impossible to make a corpse feel. Churchill erupted. He interrupted the call, insisting British troops remain to bolster French morale. Brooke didn't back down. He laid out the military reality in brutal terms. The French were broken. Their command structure had collapsed. British divisions sent back to France wouldn't save the French. They would be captured or destroyed. Britain would lose trained soldiers it couldn't replace. The argument raged for hours. Churchill demanded. Brooke refused. Finally, military reality won over political desire. Brooke evacuated the remaining British forces from western France. By June 18th, when France signed its armistice with Germany, those soldiers were safe in England. Churchill never forgot that Brooke had challenged him. More importantly, he never forgot that Brooke had been right. In July 1940, with France conquered and Britain standing alone, Churchill appointed Brooke commander and chief of home forces. The man who had saved the BEF at Dunkirk would now defend Britain itself against invasion. For 16 months, Brooke rebuilt Britain's shattered army. He organized coastal defenses, he trained divisions, he prepared for Operation Sea Lion, the German invasion that never came. And every day he worked with Churchill. The relationship was volcanic from the beginning. Churchill had energy, vision, and imagination that bordered on reckless. Brooke had professional competence, strategic clarity, and altar stubbornness that wouldn't bend. When they clashed, the walls of Whitehall shook. In December 1941, with America now in the war and global strategy suddenly transformed, Churchill needed a new chief of the Imperial General Staff. The previous, Holder, John, was exhausted from constant battles with Churchill. The job required someone who could stand up to the Prime Minister's relentless pressure. Someone who wouldn't be bullied or charmed or worn down. Churchill chose Brooke. He wanted someone who would thump the table back in him. Someone who wasn't afraid to disagree. What Churchill got was more than he bargained for. Brooke took command of Britain's military strategy at the darkest hour. Singapore would fall 2 months later. Tobruk would fall 6 months after that. German U-boat were strangling Britain's supply lines. Rommel was driving toward Egypt. The Japanese were conquering Southeast Asia. And through it all, Churchill generated ideas like a machine gun fired strategic concepts. Invade Norway, capture Sumatra, land in the Balkans, attack Rhodes. Each plan was presented with Churchill's formidable rhetorical powers. Each one had to be examined, analyzed, and often rejected by Brooke and the chiefs of staff. February 1942. Churchill's latest fixation was Norway. Operation Jupiter, he called it, a massive invasion of northern Norway to roll back German control of Scandinavia. Churchill was convinced it would strike a blow at German prestige, secure Arctic convoy routes, and potentially bring Sweden into the war. Brooke reviewed the plan with his staff. The problems were overwhelming. Norway was 1,000 miles from Britain. German forces there numbered 250,000 men. The Royal Navy would have to operate in narrow fjords without air superiority. The RAF couldn't provide cover from British bases. Landing craft were desperately needed elsewhere. And every soldier sent to Norway was a soldier not available for the campaigns that actually mattered. Brooke presented his conclusions to Churchill. The Prime Minister refused to accept them. He demanded the Joint Planning Staff reconsider. They supported Brooke's analysis. Churchill went around Brooke and asked General Andrew McNaughton to provide Canadian troops. McNaughton spent a weekend at Chequers being pressured by Churchill. He emerged, as he later told Brooke, having had a ghastly weekend, kept up all hours of the night until he did not know which way he was facing. Churchill kept the Norway idea alive for more than a year. He suggested building aircraft carriers out of ice and sawdust to solve the air cover problem. He tried to get it approved as an alternative to the Normandy invasion. Each time Brooke blocked him. The arguments were brutal. Churchill would storm and rage. Brooke would sit unmoved, sometimes snapping a pencil between his fingers as he delivered his verdict. I flatly disagree. After one particularly fierce confrontation, Churchill told his chief of staff, General Hastings Ismay, that he couldn't work with Brooke anymore. "He hates me," Churchill said. "I can see hatred looking from his eyes." Ismay passed the message to Brooke. His response revealed everything about their relationship. Hate him? I don't hate him. I love him. But the first time I tell him that I agree with him, when I don't will be the time to get rid of me. For then, I can be no more use to him. But Norway wasn't Churchill's only dangerous obsession. In 1944, with Allied victory finally within reach, Churchill developed a new fixation that threatened to derail the entire war effort. Sumatra, the northern tip of the Indonesian island. Churchill was convinced that capturing it would be the first step toward reclaiming Singapore and restoring British prestige in Asia. To Brooke, it was madness dressed in imperial nostalgia. Every strategic analysis pointed in one direction: defeat Germany first, then deal with Japan. Sumatra was thousands of miles from the center of gravity. It would drain resources from the campaigns in Europe. It had no strategic value beyond symbolic revenge for the fall of Singapore. The battle over Sumatra consumed weeks. Churchill pressed his case with all his formidable powers of persuasion. Brooke and the chiefs of staff prepared paper after paper, demonstrating why the operation made no military sense. The confrontation reached its peak in mid-February 1944, when Churchill called a meeting that turned into a 7-hour marathon of strategic argument. Brooke's diary entry that night captured his exhaustion and frustration. I wonder whether I was Alice in Wonderland, or whether I was really fit for a lunatic asylum. I don't know where we are or where we are going as regards strategy, and I just cannot get him to face the true facts. The next day, Churchill summoned Brooke to dinner. Brooke assumed he was about to be fired. Instead, Churchill never mentioned strategy. He talked about his son Randolph, who was difficult and troubled. Brooke talked about his own son Tom, with whom he had a strained relationship. They discussed their daughters. By the end of the evening, the personal relationship was restored, even as the strategic disagreement remained unresolved. Sumatra never happened. Like Norway, like dozens of other Churchillian schemes, it died in the face of Brooke's iron resistance. January 1943, Casablanca, Roosevelt, Churchill, and the combined chiefs of staff gathered to determine Allied strategy for the year ahead. The Americans wanted a cross-channel invasion of France as soon as possible. They pushed for 1943. General George Marshall argued that every day spent in the Mediterranean was a day wasted, delaying the decisive blow against Germany. Brooke and Churchill, for once united, argued for a Mediterranean strategy. But their reasoning was different. Churchill saw political opportunities in the Balkans, chances to establish British influence before the Soviets arrived. Brooke saw military necessity. He laid out his position with characteristic clarity. The Allies weren't ready for France. Not yet. American troops were brave, but inexperienced. The British Army was still rebuilding after years of defeat. Landing craft were in desperately short supply. An invasion in 1943 would be premature, potentially catastrophic. Instead, he proposed a methodical approach. Clear North Africa of Axis forces, invade Sicily, knock Italy out of the war, open the Mediterranean to Allied shipping, build up strength in England. Then, when the Germans were sufficiently weakened and Allied forces sufficiently strong, launched the cross-channel invasion. The Americans were skeptical. Some thought Brooke lacked the aggression necessary for victory. His caution seemed like defeatism. During one heated exchange, Brooke stated that no major operations on the continent would be possible until 1945 or 1946. The remark damaged his reputation among American planners, but Brooke was proven right. In February 1943, American forces encountered Rommel at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. The inexperienced troops were smashed, sent fleeing in panic. It was the worst defeat American forces would suffer in the entire war. After the battle, General Omar Bradley admitted in his memoirs that Brooke had been correct. The Americans weren't ready for France in 1943. The North Africa campaign concluded in May. Sicily fell in July and August. Italy surrendered in September. Each success validated Brooke's strategic vision. The Mediterranean strategy worked exactly as he had predicted. German reserves were pulled south. The Luftwaffe was ground down over Italy. Allied forces gained experience. Landing craft were built. Plans were refined. By the time the Allies were ready for Normandy in June 1944, they were infinitely stronger than they had been a year earlier. The invasion succeeded in part because Brooke had insisted on proper preparation. Brookie's relationship with the Americans was complex. General Dwight Eisenhower, who would command the Normandy invasion, respected Brooke's intelligence and dedication even when they disagreed. He was highly intelligent and earnestly devoted to the single purpose of winning the war. Eisenhower wrote, "He did not hesitate to differ sharply and vehemently, but he did it forthrightly and honestly. He must be classed as a brilliant soldier." But there was tension. American planners sometimes felt Brooke didn't understand their capabilities or their determination. Brookie, for his part, worried that American enthusiasm outran American experience. The disputes were real and sometimes bitter. Yet the alliance held because professionals on both sides, Brooke included, understood that disagreement on tactics didn't mean disagreement on objectives. The greatest disappointment of Brooke's war came in August 1943 at the Corvette Conference. Churchill had promised Brooke command of Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. It would be the crown of his career, the greatest command in British military history. Brookie believed it was his by right. He had spent 3 years directing British strategy, managing Churchill, coordinating with the Americans at Quebec. Roosevelt and Churchill decided the command would go to an American. The United States was providing the majority of troops and material. The commander had to be American. Churchill told Brooke almost casually, as if it were a matter of minor importance. Brookie was devastated. His diary entry that night was bitter. He had sacrificed the finest command I could ever hope for because he believed no successor could manage Churchill as effectively. It would take at least 6 months for any successor taking over for me to become as familiar with Churchill and his ways. During these 6 months, anything might happen. So he stayed, and for the next year, as the Allies prepared for and executed D-Day, Brooke remained in London, managing strategy, controlling Churchill's wilder impulses, coordinating the vast machinery of Allied military power. The breakout from Normandy in August 1944 vindicated every strategic decision Brooke had made. The landing succeeded because they were properly prepared. The Germans were weakened because they had been ground down in the Mediterranean. Allied forces were experienced because they had fought their way through North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. The cross-channel invasion worked because it happened at the right time with sufficient force against a sufficiently weakened enemy. But Brooke's work wasn't finished. In March 1945, with victory in Europe approaching, Churchill and Brooke faced their final major strategic disagreement. Churchill wanted British forces to race toward Vienna, beating the Soviets to Central Europe. He talked of the Ljubljana Gap, of liberating Austria, of establishing British influence before Stalin could dominate Eastern Europe. Brookie saw the political dimensions Churchill missed. The war in Europe was nearly won. The Pacific War remained. Resources had to be carefully allocated, and more importantly, the alliance with the Soviet Union, however uncomfortable, remained essential. Churchill's scheme risked fracturing that alliance for uncertain political gains. Once again, Brooke blocked him. Once again, military necessity overruled political ambition. After the war, historians would debate their relationship endlessly. Churchill's memoirs, published in the 1950s, said little about Brooke's role in strategic decisions. Brooke's diaries, published later, revealed the constant battles, the exhausting arguments, the near breakdowns in their working relationship. Some criticized Brooke for being too cautious, for lacking the vision Churchill possessed. Others praised him for being the brake that prevented Churchill's imagination from leading Britain into disaster. The truth was more complex. Churchill and Brooke represented two different but complementary types of leadership. Churchill provided vision, energy, and the indomitable will to never surrender. He saw possibilities others couldn't imagine. He inspired nations. He turned Britain's darkest hour into its finest. Brooke provided professional competence, strategic clarity, and the courage to tell his superior when he was wrong. He understood logistics, timing, and the brutal mathematics of military power. He knew when to attack and when to wait. He saved Churchill from himself. Together, they won the war. Field Marshal Gerhard von Rundstedt, who commanded German forces in the West, was asked after the war about Allied leadership. His assessment of Brooke was telling. The British Chief of Staff was a brilliant military mind and a master of defensive operations. German commanders respected him because he never made the mistakes they hoped for. He never attacked prematurely. He never wasted forces on meaningless objectives. He was methodical, careful, and devastatingly effective. The statue that stands outside the Ministry of Defense in Whitehall bears a simple inscription, Master of Strategy. It's an appropriate epitaph for a man whose greatest victories were the disasters he prevented. Brooke never led troops into battle during the crucial years of the war. He never commanded the great campaigns he helped plan. His name doesn't appear in popular histories the way Montgomery's or Eisenhower's do. Yet, without him, the Allied cause might well have failed. Because in war, knowing when not to fight is as important as knowing when to attack. Understanding what you cannot do is as crucial as understanding what you can. And having the courage to say no to power, even when power is wielded by Winston Churchill, can be the difference between victory and catastrophic defeat. From the beaches of Dunkirk to the fall of Berlin, Alan Brooke stood as the guardian of British strategic sanity. He absorbed Churchill's energy, channeled his genius, and blocked his follies. He managed Americans who didn't trust him, coordinated with Soviets he didn't trust, and served a prime minister who simultaneously valued and resented him. His diary entry from September 1944 captured the impossible contradiction of his position. The wonderful thing is that 3/4 of the population of the world imagine that Churchill is one of the strategists of history, a second Marlborough, and the other quarter have no idea what a public menace he is and has been throughout this war. Without him, England was lost for a certainty. With him, England has been on the verge of disaster time and again. Never have I admired and despised a man simultaneously to the same extent. That was the burden Alan Brooke carried for nearly 4 years. And by carrying it, by standing firm when others would have bent, by saying no when saying yes would have been easier, he helped save not just Britain, but the entire Allied cause from strategic ruin. In the end, that was his victory. Not the battles won, but the battles not fought. Not the invasions launched, but the invasions prevented. Not the glory claimed, but the catastrophes avoided. History remembers the commanders who attacked. It should also remember the man who knew when not to.